For nearly 9 years, between 2004 and 2012, I was a very proud member of the British Army's elite parachute regiment. And the paras, as they're more commonly known, form the very tip of the spear of the British Army's conventional ground forces. And they're widely regarded across the world as highly trained, highly experienced, very effective combat troops. And in 2008, in the summer of 2008, we were deployed to Helmand province in Afghanistan. And by then I'd already served in Iraq, but it wasn't really until I arrived in Helmand that I really began to understand what fighting in a war was really all about. Our specific unit's area of operation became known rather menacingly as the mouth of hell, because of the 150 or so of us who manned our forward operating base, nearly 1 in 3 of us would be injured or killed. And I'm told that's a higher casualty rate than that faced by British forces in the Second World War. And in fact, the fighting was so intense for us at times that we faced a similar likelihood of being wounded or killed as those troops fighting on the battlefields of the First World War. So you can see, without me going into too much detail, we had quite a difficult experience out there. So while I returned home safely, I didn't actually have a scratch on me. It wasn't really too long before the effects of the experiences I'd endured in Afghanistan began to take hold on my health. And so by then I was grieving the loss of several friends, several close friends. I'd become depressed. I'd actually become quite resentful of Western society and their apathy to my experiences and to my trauma. And I had really become very, very, very tense, physically tense. And it felt like I was being held in a stress position all the time. This was through the day, through my sleeping hours. So, which caused me to sweat excessively. And you might be able to imagine that this is probably quite exhausting, but it's also really embarrassing for me, a person in that situation, a big tough war veteran, not really supposed to be seen as sweating excessively. And so I became, in addition to the grieving the loss of so many friends and the depression and the resentment, I was actually anxious about the symptoms that I was exhibiting of my trauma. And it was by this time actually that I'd already considered suicide as a viable option twice in my life. It's actually a really tragic statistic that of those who served in the Falklands War, more committed suicide upon returning home than were actually killed in combat. And unfortunately, that's a really sad statistic that is now true for those of us who served in Afghanistan as well. So when I eventually reached out for help, I received what I now understand is quite a common response. I was offered 2 options. I was offered SSRIs or antidepressants and talking therapies like CBT. And I recognize that both of those do offer some help to many people suffering from mental ill health, but I, for one, can say that they neither really helped me at all. The antidepressants numbed me of all emotion. It wasn't just my suffering. I didn't really experience much joy either. So I thought, why continue living? It was quite a dangerous place for me to be in. And I also felt really toxic in my body. I also struggled to really relate my experiences to the well-meaning and very professional psychotherapists that I was seeing. And unfortunately, I don't really believe that this is an atypical experience within the veterans communities. Many veterans may find that antidepressants work early on at the beginning, but before long, they may need to increase their dosage to accommodate their increasing tolerance to these drugs. So they might be prescribed other pharmaceuticals that will go to make up some therapeutic cocktail, which for many people can actually feel worse than their trauma. And it also needs to be said that many veterans actually struggle to form good working relationships with psychotherapists. And because of that, they tend to bounce from one to another. But each time they're required to recount their experiences. And this is actually this causes more harm than good. So eventually I left the military in 2012. And while I had a very stable, very secure and highly paid job in the City of London, I was actually by now beginning to struggle quite significantly. I left the military with the idea that I was leaving quite an intense working environment, and that being a civilian, I might actually find some time to be peaceful and calm and avoid overly stressful situations. But anyone that's worked in the city will be able to attest that that's also quite an intense working environment. So I didn't feel much peace, and I didn't have much time to myself at that point either. And so I found myself in a position where I needed to really give antidepressants another go. But I found that I had the same experience. They numbed me of all of my emotions. They still felt toxic in my body. And I gave CBT another go, and I gave it another go after that as well. And I did eventually manage to form a relationship with one therapist, but I still found it to be more of an interesting management tool than anything else. And I really couldn't say that I felt healed by my therapy, my talking therapies at least. So hopeless as I was at this point, I attended an Armistice Day parade in 2013. And as I was laying down my wreath of remembrance for the friends that I'd lost, an elderly veteran grabbed my attention in my periphery, because I saw him. He was hysterically crying at a nearby gravesite. He was hysterical. It was heartbreaking for me to watch, but also really shocking. Shocking because I realized that if I didn't sort myself out, I could easily become that elderly veteran. You know, he's suffering terribly, probably, and I'm making a certain assumption here, but probably decades after he'd initially experienced his trauma, he's still suffering. And I did not want that to be me. You know, it was a catalyst for me. It's a really significant catalyst where I vowed to myself that I would not let that happen to me, and that I would take really any opportunity I could to heal myself from my traumas. And that's when a friend of mine suggested that I try ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a psychedelic tea that's brewed by many indigenous healers across parts of the Amazon rainforest. And at this point, taking a psychedelic tea, it kind of still felt like a bit of a wild card. But given what I'd just seen at the Armistice Day parade, and that I'd run out of all other options and didn't really feel like I had any other viable choices left, it wasn't really long before I booked my flight to Peru, and I found myself trekking through the jungle, through the rainforest, a couple of hours outside of a city called Tarapoto. And I was en route to my first ayahuasca ceremonies. In all, I spent about 10 days in the rainforest, all alone, in a little wooden hut on stilts, without any electricity or running water. I actually only had the food and the drinking water that I'd managed to carry into the rainforest with me. And every now and then, my nearest neighbor, who lived about 500 meters further upriver, he would come and visit and check in on me, and sometimes we'd share food together. But other than that, I was really left to my own devices, and I was trying not to feel too daunted by the situation I found myself in, even though really my military career had prepared me pretty well for that. And so on 2 separate occasions, a local healer from the nearest village, which was still well over an hour's hike away from where I was staying, he came and visited me and facilitated 2 of my ayahuasca ceremonies. And I have to say, it remains the most profound, the most life-changing moment in all of my experiences. It was profoundly healing. And to this day, it still feels like it's a gift from God. I left that jungle, I walked out of that jungle, and I had been healed of my psychological traumas. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to say. I'd been healed from the grief, I'd been healed from the sadness, from the depression, from the anxiety, from the resentment and the bitterness. All of it had gone. Not only that, I'd actually learned to forgive myself for the violence and the abusive behavior that I'd visited upon others up until that point. And more than that too, I'd actually been able to forgive people who had behaved violently and abusive towards me. And if all of that wasn't enough, sorry, excuse me. If that wasn't enough, I realized that I'd been given invaluable tools to live a more peaceful and a more healthy lifestyle too. And so with that, I stopped drinking. Alcohol, as we have seen from the recent charts on the other talks, is incredibly detrimental to any of us suffering from mental ill health. I also became a vegetarian, and not long after that, I became a vegan in an attempt to heal my body through nutrition and diet, which is incredibly important. But it was also an attempt to break the cycle of violence and trauma that we visit upon other sentient life forms as well. So you can see by now, I'm seeing the world in a very, very, very different light. The change was so dramatic, actually, that my son, who until then had really only seen me as some big, tough war veteran, he thought I'd gone to the jungle and been licking poisonous frogs and had gone mad, because instead of regaling him with cool war stories like he was used to, I was now talking to him about peace and love and forgiveness and the importance of the interconnectedness of all things. And so clearly everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same for me again. In the summer of 2019, I was compelled to act because of a spate of suicides within my veterans network. And over the course of roughly about 8 weeks, there were sometimes 2 suicides every day. And when you experience these rates of suicide, this level of trauma within your own community is quite overwhelming and really hard to know what to do to help. And so I was compelled to act, and it brought about the creation of the Heroic Hearts Project UK, which is an independent, non-profit organisation which is aimed at helping UK military and emergency services veterans gain legal access to psychedelic therapy at dedicated retreat centres around the world, like in countries like Peru and Colombia and Costa Rica and even the Netherlands as well. And when I checked to see if any organisation like this already existed in the UK, I couldn't find anything. But I was soon introduced to the founder of the Heroic Hearts Project in the United States, who's another veteran named Jesse Gould. And when we spoke, we found that our ambitions and intentions were really very well aligned. And so to save me from reinventing the wheel back here in England, he suggested I just start up the UK branch of the Heroic Hearts Project. And here we are today. Given the extreme nature of the professions of military and emergency services veterans, they're far more likely to experience traumatic experiences and suffer from mental ill health conditions like PTSD and depression and anxiety and even addiction than their civilian peers. And because of this, they're actually a really good barometer for measuring just how effective current options are for treating mental ill health. And so through our work at the Heroic Hearts Project, we've come to understand a little bit more about what mental health actually really means. And while there can be common themes among the symptoms that veterans may experience, really every person is unique and we believe should be treated that way. Veterans and all individuals should also have more agency with regards to their preference for their treatment and therapy, and not just simply just be told what to do, especially when they're so clearly quite ineffective and few and far between when they are. So while our main objective at Heroic Hearts is to provide legal access to veterans now by way of the retreats that we offer, we recognize that there are other very important aspects of this psychedelic renaissance that we need to take into account. One of them is the importance for more scientific research to be taking place, because it's that empirical data that, well, we would hope would help influence the minds of those in decision-making positions when it comes to drug policy reform. So with the need for further scientific research, we have actually just written our own protocols for our own observational research study into the effects of psilocybin on veterans with traumatic brain injuries. Our existing drug policies mean that we have to conduct that research abroad due to the illegality of psychedelic substances here in the UK. And so we're really, really keen to continue developing our relationships with drug policy reform groups, and specifically Crispin Blunt's Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. Crispin's actually one of our trustees, along with Charlotte, who you heard from earlier. And we're also very excited to be collaborating with Professor David Nutt's Drug Science Group. Again, Joe is the chair of the Medical Psychedelics Working Group at Drug Science. And we hope to work with them to create a very exciting compassionate access campaign, similar to the very successful campaign that's ongoing in Canada, whereby we hope to treat veterans here in the UK with psilocybin, saving them from having to travel abroad to the likes of Peru and make the journey that I did, for instance. Finally, I'm really thrilled to announce that the magnificent Dr. Sarah Tai, who you also heard from earlier, she's helping us to create our very own psychedelic integration program. And it's through that program that we hope to educate and coach the volunteers. And those people that complete that course will then be able to help provide valuable support to our service users post-therapeutic experience, because the integrative process is clearly so fundamental to the psychedelic therapeutic process. And so this is a really incredible and exciting time and place. And we're fortunate really to be living in a time when the discussion of psychedelic therapy is re-emerging. And psychedelic therapy is providing us with new and very powerful tools for us to use in our battle against mental health disorders. And it provides hope for countless individuals who seek healing. And so finally, now I'd really like to ask you that if you really want to support veterans, please support psychedelic therapy. Thank you very much for your time. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Good night.